Hi again, everyone. We're going to continue talking about evolution today. And we ended yesterday by starting to talk about the four, can you see this? Four agents of evolutionary change. That is, what are the four mechanisms that lead to descent with modification that we can measure by looking at things like allele frequencies across several generations? And these were mutation, natural selection, genetic drift, and migration. We've talked already about mutation. Mutation is the only way to generate new alleles in a population as opposed to simply shuffling the deck via recombination when you cross over genes and chromosomes during meiosis. What we're going to cover next is natural selection. And natural selection is one readily observed mechanism of evolution. What do I mean by readily observed? When you look at the features of most organisms and you ask, why does it look the way that it does? Your default answer should likely be natural selection. It is an incredibly powerful force in adapting populations to their environment. And that word adapting has a colloquial definition that we're all familiar with, but it has a very specific definition in evolutionary biology that we'll talk about. So it's important to understand that evolution and natural selection are not the same thing. Evolution, as we know, is this broader definition of organisms changing through time, descent with modification. And then your question is, well, how do they change over time? And natural selection is simply one of several mechanisms that lead to that change. So there are four conditions that have to be met for natural selection to occur. And these conditions were outlined by Darwin in his paper and in his book on the origin of species. And basically, what he laid out makes a lot of logical sense. And this came about from his observations on his trip. And basically, this is what he saw. Everywhere he went, he saw that there are more offspring born than can survive. And he remembered what Thomas Malthus said about humans, how there will be this struggle for existence because there are limiting resources. There's not enough food, space, water for people. And Darwin saw the exact same thing in the natural world. The next thing Darwin saw was that when he looked at a bunch of offspring that had been born, that there were variation everywhere. Pick a trait and it varied. If birds hatched out in a nest, there was variation in the size of the offspring, or there was variation on when they hatched, or there was variation on how aggressive they were for calling for food. He also noticed that variation tended to be heritable, that parents with certain traits would pass those traits on to offspring. And what he said was that some of those traits are likely favorable to survival, whereas others are not. And those with favorable traits will be selected, natural selection, to basically pass on their genes to the next generation. And in this way, organisms can sort of change through time by passing on these favorable traits. So individuals with particular versions of traits that lead to increased survival and, more importantly, more offspring than those with bad versions of the trait are basically naturally selected. So that's why we call it natural selection. Now, this link between survival and reproduction is important because you can imagine a scenario where an organism produces a trait that lets it live to a ripe old age, but perhaps at the same time makes it difficult to reproduce. That's not a trait that's very beneficial because it's not going to be able to pass on its genes. For an example of this, watch the video in lab from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology that talks about natural selection and something else Darwin described, sexual selection. So the first condition for there to be selection is that there has to be something to select from, and that's why variation is so key to evolution. If mutation is the generator of new variation, it generates new alleles. Variation is the fuel, it is the gasoline on which evolution, and in particular natural selection, works. If there is no variation, then there's nothing to select from. Everything is the same. So selection is contingent upon variation. And we see this when we look at artificial selection, like we've already discussed as well. If you are breeding for a particular trait in dogs or in cattle or whatever, you are selecting for particular traits from among several different variants. So first and foremost, we have to have variation. And fortunately, variation is everywhere. It is built into the DNA of organisms. One of the reasons why I kept hammering home during the reproductive lectures that sexual reproduction was really useful because it reshuffles the deck is because it creates new combinations of genes, new variants, because each combination is in essence a different variant. And that variation is what is so important for natural selection. So variation, again, is everywhere. It's all around us. Any organism, any trait is likely to vary. And variation is the raw material on which evolution works, or at least natural selection. Two, is that variation has to be heritable, right? If a trait is variable and some of that variation is useful and some of it isn't, but you can't pass that on to your offspring, then how would we expect subsequent generations or descendants to be different from previous generations? They wouldn't. So heritability is also really critical to this idea of natural selection. And Darwin understood this, even though his ideas and his writings were several decades before Mendel came along. So the concept of heritability was not unknown to Darwin, but the mechanism, he had no idea. It was Mendel who figured that out, maybe 20 years after Darwin published his book. Finally, as I keep mentioning, there has to be differential reproductive success. And that just means that some organisms leave more offspring than others. And another way of thinking about that is that some organisms pass on more of their genes than others. And that's really the goal of organisms. I know it's sort of weird to think about organisms having a goal, but ultimately that's what organisms exist to do, is to pass on their genes to future generations. And because there are more organisms that are born than can survive, they can't all do that. There's simply not enough resources around for all organisms that are born to survive. There simply isn't. We know that there is a struggle for existence. Look anywhere in the natural kingdom, and animals are escaping from predators or dying of disease or struggling to find food or whatever it is. So resources are very limited. But we know that there are certain organisms with suites of traits that seem to be more successful than other organisms. And we're talking about a single species or a single population here. So within a species, within a population, there are some organisms with a collection of traits that seem better suited to survival and reproduction than others. And so that's what we mean by differential reproductive success. From all the variation, and you could examine one trait, but it probably makes more sense to look at it collectively as a suite of traits. From all the variation existing within a population, individuals with traits most suited to survival and ultimately reproduction in their environment generally leave more offspring than individuals with other traits. So this is a sad example, but if this was a group of wild dogs, and here's a bunch of puppies, if this was a runt who was unable to get milk, then he might not grow up as quickly, or he might even starve in puppyhood like this. And any of those maladapted or deleterious traits that he have, it's a dead end. He's not going to pass them on to his offspring. So in this way, subsequent generations seem to become better suited to living in their particular environment because their genes are constantly sort of being modified and edited to fit best within a certain environment. And I'll give you some examples as to what I mean by that in just 1 second. So here's a summary, and let's actually look at genes here, or alleles, instead of looking at a trait. So Let's examine that there is a trait and it varies. There's several different alleles, and that variation is represented by these colors. So we start off with a lot of variation, and fortunately, that variation is heritable. So one organism can pass that variation to its offspring. And what we see is that over several generations, one of these variants tends to increase its market share, tends to increase in numbers more than the other ones. And this gives us some information. Something about this organism allows it to pass on its genes at a higher rate. It's more successful at passing on its genes than any of these other variants here. And over time, what we would expect to see is that population change to be more represented by this blue allele than the green allele or the teal allele or the yellow allele or the purple allele. That's exactly what natural selection is. Nature, the environment, is selecting winners and losers based upon everything that's in the environment. What is the best set of traits to live in a snowy area? Well, that's going to be very different than a set of traits to live in a desert area. And that's going to be very different than a set of traits to live in a jungle. And so natural selection really shapes and hones how organisms look depending on where it is they live. And this is why I said, when you look around and you see organisms in nature and you want to know why it is they look the way they do, natural selection is your best bet, because natural selection selects for traits that optimize an organism's ability to live in a given environment. So, take home message. Natural selection is a mechanism of evolution that occurs when there is heritable variation for a trait, and individuals with one version of that trait have greater reproductive success than individuals with a different version of that trait. The end result of natural selection, the end result of this process, is adaptation. You often hear that organisms are adapted to their environments. And all that means is that traits have evolved by natural selection that lead to increased reproductive success in a given environment. So you might say, well, a polar bear is well adapted to live in Arctic environments. Well, why? Well, it has white hair. I guess actually its hair is clear, I've heard, but whatever. It looks like snow. So that's an adaptation. That's something that evolved by natural selection because it works in that environment. It's not brown because then you'd be able to see it, and it's not black because then you'd be able to see it. It's white so it can hide from things like seals that it's trying to catch. Polar bears are really good swimmers. Why? Because they leave the ice and they go swimming for stuff. So that's an adaptation for living in Arctic environments. They have a lot of fat. That's an adaptation for living in Arctic environments. If you took this polar bear and dropped it off in the Mojave Desert, east of Palm Springs, suddenly those traits aren't very useful. So adaptation is very specific to a given environment. Organisms seem to be fit for their own environment, and if you took them out of that environment, suddenly everything would go wrong. That's a hallmark of natural selection. So basically, in a nutshell, adaptation are traits that are caused by natural selection that cause some individuals to have more offspring than others, and therefore they become more prevalent in the population. Now, there's a term that I described yesterday that we're going to revisit today called fitness. And fitness is the ultimate measure of reproductive success. So if you're trying to measure reproductive success within organisms, the measure we use is something called fitness. And fitness is defined as a measure of the relative amount of reproduction of an individual with a particular phenotype compared with the reproductive output of individuals of the same species or population with alternative phenotypes, with variation. Now notice that it says a measure of the relative amount, because it doesn't matter how many offspring you have. It only matters that you have more offspring than anyone else. That's what's important. If you want your market share of whatever trait you're looking at to increase relative to some other alternative variant, all that matters is that you leave more than anyone else. It's not the total amount that you leave. So let's go back to our fruit fly example at the beginning of yesterday's lecture. We have flies, and one fly carries a gene or a set of genes for a version of a trait that allows it to survive a long time without food. So that's our starvation resistant gene or sets of genes. The other fly has genes for a different version of that trait that allows it to survive only a short time without food. In that system, within that context, which fly has greater fitness? And you likely answered, oh, the one that can survive a long time without food. And that's correct. And it was important that I said within this system, within this context, because fitness is very contextual. It's only important that you have a set of genes that allows you to survive a long time without food if that's something you're going to encounter in nature. Otherwise, who cares? If it's not going to have an effect on fitness, then it's not really a big deal. And I'll show you again what I mean by that with an example in just a second. So one way that you can again think about natural selection is that the alleles carried by an individual with higher fitness, that is, those traits favored by natural selection, will simply increase their market share in a population over time. And that, as we know, is evolution. Okay, let's talk a bit more about this concept of relative fitness and what do I mean by fitness being context dependent? Well, first, an individual's fitness is measured relative to other genotypes or phenotypes in the population. So we generally refer to fitness as relative fitness. It doesn't matter if you have one offspring and everyone else has 0, or if you have 101 offspring and everyone else has 100. Your relative fitness is more or less the same. You're leaving one more individual per generation than everyone else. So again, it's not the total amount of offspring you leave, it's how much you leave relative to everyone else. 2, fitness is context dependent and can change depending on the environment within which the organism lives. I'm going to move my little thing up here so that we can see this a little better. So these are mice that live in the sand hills of places like Nebraska. And what you can see is that there's variation here in coat color. So you have mice that are more sand colored or sort of this light sandy color, and mice that are darker here. And the sand color itself varies. So there are, depending on which area you're in and the color of sand, your relative fitness will vary. So you might be on a sand dune with relatively light colored sand, in which case the fitness of light colored mice is higher than that of dark colored mice, but only a short distance away. The sand might change color, and the fitness effects are completely opposite. Now the darker colored mice have much higher fitness than the lighter colored mice, and we can see this by observing their proportion of market share shifting over time. And what's really interesting is that this has actually been shown experimentally. So experimenters went to this area in Nebraska and set up little experimental plots and moved mice back and forth and watched how the phenotype would shift over several generations as you moved either dark mice to light sand or light mice to dark sand. A very, very cool study. Okay. And this says 3, fitness depends on an organism's reproductive success compared to other individuals or organisms in the population. Of course, we already basically discussed that. That's the whole concept, is that you need to leave more offspring than everyone else. So take-home message. Fitness is a measure of the relative amount of reproduction of an individual with a particular phenotype or genotype, because again, we could be talking about the fitness of a whole organism relative to another organism. So looking at its entire genome. or you could look at a particular trait like coat color. It depends on what you want to look at. An individual's fitness can vary depending on the environment in which the individual lives. And so this can change depending on whether an organism actually moves physically, but it can also change with time. The environment changes from generation to generation. And so what might be very successful for a particular organism now might not necessarily be the case in the future as the environment changes. So organisms in a population seem to become better matched to their environment through natural selection. And that's what adaptation is. It's when an organism looks like it belongs in its particular environment, like that polar bear in the Arctic. So it's natural selection that creates these sort of good fits of organisms to their environment. So take-home message. Adaptation, which is the process by which organisms become better matched to their environment through natural selection, and the specific features that make an organism more fit, are the direct result of natural selection. Evolution in general doesn't guide organisms towards betterness or perfection. It just makes them fit for their environment. It just makes them, the whole point of natural selection is to just be better than everyone else, not to be perfect. And the idea of this, of course, is that if the environment changes, you want enough flexibility, you want enough variation, that you have alleles that for particular traits that can be favored by natural selection if the environment changes. So if you have a perfect organism and everybody has those same alleles and you no longer have any variation, well, what happens if the environment changes in the next generation? Then you're kind of in trouble. Okay, one more take-home message for that, and this is important, is that natural selection causes adaptation. End of story. Mutation can cause adaptation. How? Because mutation leads to new alleles, and if natural selection then favors those alleles in a population, voila, you have adaptation. If mutation leads to deleterious alleles, then natural selection says, no, those are no good, and those genes aren't passed on, and those new mutations are removed from the population. So this is what we were talking about yesterday when we said that mutation is random, and we don't really know what the outcome is until natural selection works on a population. We don't know what will happen to a mutation until it's released in the environment and we see whether it alters the fitness of an organism. So a mutation can lead to adaptation if natural selection favors that mutation. But that's it. Only mutation and natural selection lead to adaptation. Everything else we're about to talk about can change allele frequencies in a population, but it's random. It's not natural selection. Okay, let's move on to the next one here, which is genetic drift. And genetic drift is a random change in allele frequencies in a population due basically to dumb luck. Small populations, like this group of beetles, there's 9 beetles here, 3 green and 6 brown, tend to not contain as much genetic variation as large populations. This gene for shell color has 2 alleles, one that leads to green, one that leads to brown. And let's just say we're walking through a forest one day and we happen to squish, by random chance, 2 of the green beetles. Now we only have a single green beetle, but still 6 of the brown beetles. So the market share has changed. The frequency of green relative to brown has changed, but it had nothing to do with natural selection. Sometimes by random chance, certain individuals leave more offspring than others. It's better to be lucky than to be good. The important factor that distinguishes what we just saw with genetic drift from natural selection is that the change or shift in allele frequency between green and brown was not related at all to the allele's influence on reproductive success, right? We don't know whether green or brown was more fit in the example I just gave you, but we still managed to change the frequency of green relative to brown by just accidentally squishing some beetles. So therefore, it's not an adaptation because it doesn't have anything to do with fitness. It doesn't lead to adaptations. Now, I mentioned that small populations tend to not have as much variation. And what this means is that the impact of genetic drift is much greater in small populations than in large populations. Let me fix this. What if instead of squishing 3 green beetles here, I just went ahead and squished all 3? Excuse me, what if instead of squishing 2, I squished all 3? What would happen to the green allele? It would be gone. It would be completely gone from that population, and our variation would drop to 0. All we would have would be, brown beetles. But what if instead of 10 beetles, we had 10,000 beetles? Same frequency, 3,000 green, 6,000 brown. But in this new scenario, I still only squished 3 green beetles. So now instead of 3,000 green beetles, we have 2,997. Had the market shares of green and brown changed? You might argue yes, but by a tiny, tiny fraction. So in reality, not really. So large populations and populations with lots of genetic variation are somewhat buffered against the effects of genetic drift. Why is this important? Because many populations of real organisms are threatened with extinction, and there just aren't a lot of individuals. And what this means is that when you get down to relatively few individuals, random events, random acts can actually eliminate organisms, can eliminate or cause extinction in organisms because of genetic drift. And I'm going to give you an example right now. Well, before that, let me mention this. When we squished, in our first example, all of the green beetles, and we were left with only brown, it led to something called fixation. Fixation is something that happens in situations where populations are small. Fixation is when one allele goes to 100%. So the brown allele goes to 100%. If this happens, like I said, there's no more variability in the population for this gene, and therefore the amount of genetic variation has been reduced. So the key take-homes for genetic drift that we just went over are: 1, it has a greater effect in small populations, and 2, as I'll show you in a real-world example in just a second, it tends to decrease the amount of genetic variation in a population. In the real world, the 2 cases of genetic drift that we frequently observe are called founder effects and population bottlenecks. And bottlenecks are what happens when populations get really small and near extinction, and then something random happens that causes a reduction in genetic variation. So let's take a look at a population bottleneck right now. This animal that you can't really see because I'm blocking it is Mirounga angustirostris. It's a northern elephant seal. These things can get 15, 20 feet long, 10,000 pounds, just enormous animals. At one point in the late 1800s, there were only 20 individuals left on Earth. They were all on an island off the coast of Baja. Now today, there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of northern elephant seals. But at one point, there were only 20. But before there were only 20, going back into the past, there were once again hundreds of thousands. So that reduction from a large population into a very small population back to a large population is why it's called a population bottleneck. And let's see what happens when we have a population bottleneck. Let's start with 100 marbles, okay, in a bag. And there's a certain number of colors, and these colors represent genetic variation and their market share. So we have 28 white, 40 green, and 32 pink or red. And if you had to draw 10 marbles out at random and say, these are the individuals who are going to reproduce to generate the next 100 individuals, the next generation, you would assume, because of these numbers here, the 28, 40, and 32, that you would get roughly the same percentage. You'd get roughly 20 to 30% of these white guys, about 40% of these green guys, and about 32% of these guys. So let's say 2 of these guys, 4 of these guys, and 4 of these guys. So let's draw them at random, and this is what we get. We get 2 white, 5 green, and 3 pink. Now, each of these individuals is going to produce 10 offspring, and that'll get us back to our starting point of 100. So if we had 2 white, we should get 20 white individuals in generation 2. If we had 5 green, 50 green in generation 2. And then 3 pink, 30 in generation 2. Now what's going to happen is, due to hunting or something else, the population is going to be decreased dramatically. We're going to enter our population bottleneck. And so now, instead of picking 10 marbles out to breed, we're only going to pick 3 marbles out. And of those 3 marbles, we picked 0 white, only 2 green, and 1 red. All right. So just by chance, we happen to not pick any white individuals. And again, each of these guys are going to reproduce to produce our next generation. We'll have 0 of the white here. It looks like each one is only producing 4 offspring. So we have 8 green here and 4 red. And notice what happened here. Because of this bottleneck, because of this reduction in population size of the breeding individuals, just by random chance, when we reached into the bag of marbles, we didn't end up picking a white marble. Even though there were 20 of them in there, we only picked 3, and none of them were white, which means that the population bottleneck reduced the amount of genetic variation. We actually lost an allele. So in the future, when the population recovers back to having several 100,000 northern elephant seals, you once again still do not have that white allele. So there's been a reduction in the total amount of genetic variation, even though the numbers of individuals have increased. And so you might wonder why that's important. And it's very important for things like immune systems, where the more variation there is, the more different types of diseases you can fight. So individuals with low genetic variation in their immune systems, that's bad, because if a new pathogen like COVID-19 happens to attack a population and one individual is very susceptible, well, because they all basically have the same immune systems, everyone is very susceptible. But if there's a lot of variation, which is the whole point of sexual reproduction and natural selection, then you would assume that there would be some variants that have immune systems capable of fighting the new disease. So this is the whole point of why variation is good, because the more variation you have, the more things there are to potentially select from. Okay, a second type of genetic drift is called a founder effect. And a founder effect is simply when a small number of individuals leaves a population and founds a new population. So let me give you an example using beetles again. We have some ladybugs or lady beetles, and we have green and red alleles. And they're pretty evenly represented on this mainland population. But if there's a hurricane or a storm and it happens to just randomly pick up one red beetle and plop it onto an island, well, it doesn't matter again. It doesn't matter who's more fit, red or green. The only individual to make it to that new island and found that population carries red alleles, and therefore all of its descendants will carry red alleles. Notice the amount of genetic variation in this new population is reduced because we no longer have the green allele. So that's an example of a founder effect. So take-home message. Genetic drift is a random change in allele frequencies within a population that is unrelated to the allele's influence on reproductive success. Therefore, it does not cause adaptations. But it can still be an important and significant driver of evolutionary change particularly, as we saw, when populations are small. When we only had 10 beetles and we crushed 2 of one type, that drastically changed the allele frequencies. When northern elephant seal populations were reduced to only 20 individuals, we likely lost a significant amount of genetic variation within that population. All right, we will talk about migration next, but let's take a break before we start our next video.